Welcome to this online lesson on the Treaty of Versailles. How did the Allies want to punish Germany? A reminder that the Allies were Britain, France and the USA, the countries that had actually won World War I, and other countries as well that were allied with them. So within this lesson, we're going to have a look at the motivations of these key allies. Once we've done that, we're also going to have a look at the main terms of the Treaty of Versailles and what was done to Germany. There'll be an opportunity for some source work and some exam practice and a consideration of why this treaty was so unpopular with the Germans too. So all in all, it's going to be about a half-hour lesson. Nevertheless, you could do just parts of it if you're trying to revise, or you could do the whole lot as a standalone lesson. It's entirely up to you. Let's first of all have a look at this cartoon, one that I find particularly fascinating. It's a cartoon that's titled Peace and Future Cannon Fodder. Here's a key term for us then, the Treaty of Versailles itself. This was the peace treaty or agreement that ended World War I. It was signed in 1919 and named after the Palace of Versailles just outside Paris where the treaty was signed. This cartoon was produced in 1919 and it was called Peace and Future Cannon Fodder. The crying child is labelled Class of 1940, representing children who would be leaving school or adults by the year 1940. We've got a further caption at the bottom. It says, "The Tigre. Curious, I seem to hear a child weeping." This refers to the man in the foreground, who represents Georges Clemencau, who was the president of France at the time, or rather the prime minister, I should say. Behind, we can see the leaders of Italy, the United States, and the United Kingdom. So what is really meant by this? Well, this cartoon produced in 1919 is suggesting that that child of who would be an adult by the year 1940 would have every reason to cry as they would be involved in yet another world war. Would that come true? Well, yes, it would. This cartoon is only 1 year out. In fact, French leaders like Ferdinand Foch said that the Germans were not punished harshly enough by the Treaty of Versailles and that all that they had done was buy a 20-year armistice, a 20-year break in the fighting. He would turn out to be right. But actually, in hindsight, did the Treaty of Versailles do more to cause World War II, rather than not punishing Germany harshly enough? We'll just have to see, won't we? It's a matter of interpretation, as are so many things in history. Let's first of all consider the motivations of these four people. You might want to produce this as a mind map or maybe some structured notes. The heading should be David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom, Georges Clemencau of France, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, and Friedrich Ebert of Germany. So what did the leaders want at the peace treaty? Make a note of these headings now, and then we'll hear from them. We're going to hear from David Lloyd George first of all. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919. He also attended the peace treaty. For each of these characters, I'm going to invite them to speak on the microphone in a moment. I should warn you though, my time machine is very much down to a United Kingdom school budget, and so therefore the accents that they will speak with will be distorted. In other words, they won't be very good. Nevertheless, for a bit of fun, hopefully they'll sound something like they would have done. Oh, I should point out, Lloyd George was actually from North Wales, so if you're expecting him to sound like one of the cast members of the famous TV show Gavin and Stacey, you'll be slightly wrong. Let's hear from Lloyd George. First of all, I want to make it absolutely clear that we are absolutely determined that there should not be another war in Europe if we can possibly avoid it. Nevertheless, I need to have some sense of balance in the treaty. Germany should be punished, that is for sure. But we as a British government should ensure that the Germans are not unduly punished and should not be completely destroyed. There are very good reasons for this. First of all, I wish you to understand that the British people have really suffered in this terrible conflict. We have lost almost 1 million soldiers killed and several thousand civilians killed in air raids and rationing too. In fact, the rationing was one of the most frightening parts of the war, with so many of our supplies coming from overseas and sunk by dastardly German submarines. Therefore, we do want to punish the Germans. We've spent huge sums of money on the war. It would be good to get some of this money back from the Germans. However, we must be careful not to completely destroy the German economy. After all, we want to be able to trade with them after the war and help rebuild our own economy too. Most of all, though, we wish to avoid any future conflicts of this nature in Europe. And so we must be careful. We must try and beat Germany in the sense that they will feel punished, in the sense that the British people will feel that they have got justice. But we must be careful not to punish the Germans so harshly that they will never again have any pride and they will want to once again start a war in Europe, which would be truly disastrous. All right, you can pause the video here, make any notes that you need to on David Lloyd George's desires for this treaty, and in a moment we'll see whether he got what he wanted. Let's consider Georges Clemencau, though. He was the Prime Minister of France, nicknamed Le Tigre, the Tiger. This was supposedly after his rather ferocious nature. We are very clear in France that we wish to punish the Germans very harshly indeed. France has suffered terribly in World War I. We have lost almost 2 million soldiers and civilians killed. Unlike the British, our fair country was invaded by the Germans. Many of our eastern cities and towns have been completely destroyed by the war. We wish for them to be rebuilt exactly as they were. And who will pay for it? The Germans will pay for it. Most of all, though, we wish to remain safe from German attack forevermore. Therefore, I must demand that the Germans are allowed no troops near to the French border, and I demand that certain possessions of France will be taken back by France after Germany had taken them off of us. This does not just include land captured in this war, but also land which was ceded to Germany before. For example, Alsace-Lorraine, which was ceded to Germany, or Prussia as it was in the time, during the 19th century. If we do not punish Germany harshly enough, it will only spell disaster for future generations. All right, so pause the video here, make any notes that you wish to on Georges Clemencau. Let's consider the status of Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America. His line on Germany is rather different, and sure, many Americans still wanted revenge, but the scale of the loss, well, that's something else. You must understand that the Americans have joined this war rather later than our European allies. We joined the war in 1917, partly as a response to the German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. Nevertheless, it took us around a year to mobilize our troops and get sufficient numbers over to the French battlefields to start having an impact on the war. So US troops had not encountered serious fighting until the final year of the war. And that meant that our losses were rather lighter than those suffered by the United Kingdom, its empire, and indeed our allies, the French. We lost around about 117,000 soldiers killed in the war, which is very difficult for the American public to accept, but a far lighter loss than was suffered by many of the people in Europe. Therefore, my main motivation is to avoid the United States of America being drawn into future conflicts in Europe, conflicts that we feel we should not have to have a part in. And the American public begrudges having to send so many of our brave boys overseas to fight in European wars, which to many of the American people, they don't really seem to be our business. I therefore propose, as do many of my friends and colleagues, a League of Nations. This should be an organization of United Nations, if you will, which can meet and discuss the problems in the world, arguments and disputes, and attempt to settle them peacefully by using discussion and by using sanctions towards countries which are not behaving, rather than having to resort to outright warfare. We hope that in this way we can ensure that this will be the war to end all wars. All right, pause the video here and make any notes that you wish on Woodrow Wilson. That might have been the worst accent yet. Lastly then, let's consider Friedrich Ebert. He was the first president of the new Weimar Republic, Germany. He really does have his work cut out. Firstly, I wish to make it clear that Germany has not actually been invited to attend these peace talks. This hardly seems fair, but we have little choice but to accept these circumstances. You see, Germany has been militarily defeated. Anyone who tells you otherwise is telling a lie. We will have no choice but to accept these peace terms, however harsh they may be. However, we are hopeful that sense will prevail and that our former enemies will not treat us too harshly. Privately, though, I do not hold out much hope for these circumstances. You should see that not all Germans, unfortunately, believed that Germany had lost the war. And many of the right-wing groups in Germany believe in this nonsense idea of the Durchstoß, or the stab in the back theory. This states that communists and Jewish people and other groups had somehow betrayed the German soldiers out on the front line by suing for peace when we could have won. The unfortunate thing is that in March of 1918, it looked as if we were winning. But supply problems and a lack of soldiers and a fierce counterattack by the Allies meant that we could not force a victory. Unfortunately, the Kaiser's government hid this from the German people, and therefore many people didn't understand that actually we were utterly defeated by the November of 1918 when we asked for the armistice and the break in the fighting. So Germany itself is also in a state of complete turmoil. We have had terrible famines, partly caused by the British naval blockade of Germany. And let us not forget that we suffered too. 1.7 million German soldiers have died in this war. We are also facing attempts to overthrow this new government. Meanwhile, back in October of 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm decided to abdicate the throne and quit being king. Since then, we have been attempting to set up a new Weimar constitution and a new democratic way of running Germany. All of these attempts are being seriously undermined, such as the Spartacist uprising in January 1919, where a group of communists tried to overthrow the government. This is precisely why we are referred to ourselves as the Weimar Republic. The German government, we had to flee Berlin, our capital, and set up our government in Weimar instead. So I hope that the Allies are not unduly harsh to Germany. If they are, I really fear for the future of our nation. All right, pause the video here and make some notes on Friedrich Ebert and what the Weimar Republic hoped to get out of the agreement. Bear in mind, though, most of these hopes are not going to come true. So now we're going to go on to our main task. This is a bit where you really will need to take your most detailed notes. So we've seen the motivations of the different groups, and ultimately it looks like Germany's going to be really harshly punished. Luckily for you, there's an easy way of remembering how. You're going to record the main terms or rules of the Treaty of Versailles on your book or on a piece of paper or however you want to do it in the form of a mind map. LAM is an acronym for explaining the main terms. So if you want, you could draw a nice sheep in the middle. This might seem silly, but if it helps you to remember the term LAM, then that will really help. Pop the heading, the Treaty of Versailles 1919, on your sheep. First, land. You're going to put detailed and specific examples of what land and empire Germany gave up. Then, in the next section, army. Put detailed, specific examples of how Germany's armed forces were weakened. Then, you're going to list money. Put detailed, specific examples of how much Germany was charged and why. And lastly, blame. Put detailed and specific examples of how and why Germany was blamed for World War I. Land, army, money, blame, or LAM for short. Not bad, eh? Oh gosh, that was terrible. Anyway, make a start on your mind map now, leave plenty of space to write some specific details, and press play when you're ready to continue. Done? Well, let's take each of these terms in turn and make sure you make some detailed notes. Anything that's too vague will just be too woolly and not helpful to you. Okay, that's almost the last of the sheep puns. If you need an extension, you could explain why the Germans would have hated specific examples from the treaty. After all, was it fair to them? What effect did it have on them? Term 1, land. All right, this is a bit of a blurry map, but we can also already see that we got some labels. For example, one of the former German cities, a place called Danzig, was made a free city run by the League of Nations. This was done so that Poland, a country which was largely re-established by the Treaty of Versailles, could have access to the sea to help with trade. Also, the Saar coalfields were given over to France for 15 years, which was partly to pay for the damage in World War I. Notice the orange area as well. This was a demilitarized zone. In other words, the Germans were not allowed to station any soldiers here whatsoever. Notice how it's on the border with the Netherlands, but particularly Belgium and France. That meant that they would feel more secure from German attack. So, one note that we could have is that Belgium gained a small amount of land from Germany. But also, Germany lost the whole of its empire. This was shared amongst the other European powers. Denmark also gained a small amount of land from Germany. One of the most significant losses of land, though, came when Germany was split in two. Notice that East Prussia, in brown there, is split from the remainder of Germany. Germany lost land to Poland, which split the country in two, and the city of Danzig became international, as I've mentioned. Also, Germany had to give the Sudetenland region to Czechoslovakia. This remained full of German-speaking peoples and would cause a lot of problems in the lead up to World War II. Germany was also not allowed to unite with Austria. Remember, the country of Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany in World War I. Some Germans believed that a way of strengthening the country would be to unite with Austria, an idea that was known as the Anschluss. Well, the Treaty of Versailles said that that wasn't allowed. Also, France got back land that had been captured by the Germans in 1871, or more correctly, by the Prussians. Germany had to give coal and steel to the French as well as part of a reparations payment, but more on that when we look at money. Lastly, overall, Germany has shrunk in size by a total of 13%. Alright, pause the video here, make some detailed notes on how land was affected by the Treaty of Versailles, and then we'll move on. Done? I think some of the key headlines here are, for example, Germany shrinking by 13% in total, the demilitarized zone, and the loss of all of Germany's empire. Let's consider the issue of the army. Here are some pictures to give you a few thoughts. Firstly, the German Navy has been limited by the Treaty of Versailles. It's not been completely outlawed, but it has been very much made smaller, so that Germany can have, say, a coastal defence force, but not something that could attack another nation. The German Navy have been limited to 6 battleships, of the sort that are seen in the picture there, 6 cruisers, which are about half the size of a battleship, and 6 destroyers, which again are about quarter the size of a battleship, if not rather smaller than that. They were not allowed any submarines whatsoever. Remember that the submarines had been one of the crucial weapons of World War I and had helped to try and strangle Britain of the resources. The submarine warfare had also drawn the United States into the war, so it's hardly surprising that the Allies were keen to have the Germans surrender all of their submarines. The next is that Germany was forbidden from having any air force. Air power was very much a feature of World War I and something that was one of the crucial new technologies, and by 1918 it had evolved into quite the formidable force. Specifically, the Allies demanded that the feared Fokker D-7 fighter planes, like the one pictured here, were handed over. This was actually listed in the treaty specifically. Next, the German army was limited to just 100,000 men and officers. It had numbered in the millions before. This was barely enough to even police riots in Germany like the Spartacist uprising, let alone actually defend it against attack. Also, no troops were allowed into the Rhineland border area with France. That's the demilitarized zone that hopefully you made a note on before. Lastly, Germany was banned from having tanks in its army. The Allies absolutely were able to have tanks. Think about how the German army has been weakened here, so that A, it wouldn't be able to attack a potential enemy, such as France, and so that B, if needs be, its former enemies could attack Germany without too much fear of a strong defence. Not great for a country that previously held its armed forces in such high regard. Pause the video here and make some detailed notes under the heading Army. Okay, halfway. What next? Well, one point about the army is that Germany's ships that had to be surrendered, many of which were sent up to the British base at a place called Scapa Flow. You could say that the Germans had the last laugh, though. They decided to scuttle their own ships rather than surrender them to the Allies. Mind you, weirdly, the British were probably quite happy about that. The British fleet at this time was the largest in the world. The last thing they wanted is for some people, like the French, for example, to get a fleet of almost that size because they were able to steal some ships off the Germans. Nevertheless, maybe it's the German sailors had the last laugh here, as they didn't have to surrender their ships after all. Have a look at this photograph here. This is a photograph taken before the First World War. It shows the main church or cathedral in Ypres, which is in Belgium. Behind it, that other building with a tower, which also looks a bit like a church, is in fact what they call the medieval cloth hall. This was a major trading centre for wool in the Middle Ages, and probably the most famous building within the city. And this is what they looked like after the war. Ypres remained under almost constant shell fire throughout the war. Very little was left standing. Compare that to today. Well, hang on. It appears that those ruined buildings have been completely rebuilt. They also appear to have been completely rebuilt in an almost identical way. Although, is it just me, or do some of the towers on the cloth hall actually look even grander than they were before? A bit suspicious. How did the Belgians end up being able to afford all of this? Well, the simple answer is they didn't pay for it. Section 3. Money. World War I had caused more destruction and loss of life than any previous war. French and Belgian cities such as Ypres had been completely levelled. The Germans were forced to pay for the repairs through compensation known as reparations. Okay, take a look at that word. You can see that it's almost got the word repair in it. So these are payments that are designed to repair damage for the war. The cost was £6.6 billion. Yes, that's £6.6 billion in the money of the time. You can times that by about 100 in today's terms. Maybe slightly less than that, but maybe slightly more. The point is that the Germans took many decades to finish paying this back. In fact, they only finished paying it back less than 15 years ago. This cost financially ruined Germany, which, let's not forget, was pretty much ruined in the first place. At one point, in 1923 to 1924, Germany was printing money, causing a hyperinflation where German money lost all of its value. But that's maybe a message for another lesson. Germany had also suffered in the war, but it was forced to pay everything to repair the damage. The German government finished paying this, like I say, in about 2010. Alright, pause the video here, make some notes under the heading of money. Think also about why this would have been so unpopular and why it would have seemed so unfair to the German people. Done? Let's move on to the next section. Finally, blame. Have a look at the cartoon in the bottom right. This was produced by a right-wing group after the war. It shows a communist in red stabbing a German soldier in the back. The insinuation being that Germany had been somehow betrayed. This wasn't really true. But the point is, many people believed that it was. In order to force the Germans to accept other restrictions, the Allies forced them to accept total blame for starting the war. Okay, we could argue about this for ages, and historians still do. Germany did, I believe, have some responsibility for the start of World War I. Possibly in some respects more responsibility than other countries. Did it have complete responsibility for starting the war? No, that's nonsense. But Germany had to accept total blame for the war. Think about why that's important given what else is being made, Germany is being made to do. The blame clause was known as Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, better known to us as the War Guilt Clause. This was hated by German people who felt it was both untrue and unfair. The German Kaiser, that's Kaiser Wilhelm II, the king, had quit. This meant that many people felt that their newly elected government had stabbed the German army in the back by surrendering and accepting blame. Many right-wing people were reluctant to blame their beloved Kaiser for the failure. This Dolchschloss theory wasn't true, and it was later used by Nazis to make people hate communists and Jews, who they blamed for losing the war. Again, and I hope I've made this clear now, it's not true, but that's what people believed. Alright, make some notes on this topic of blame to complete your mind map. Press play when you're ready to continue. You can consolidate your learning through a heads and tails activity now. See if you can write out these sentence starters in the examples column and complete it with the correct part from the explanations column. Here they all are. Pause the video now, complete the sentences, and then we'll go through the answers. So Germany was forced to pay £6.6 billion in reparations. Which one does that go with? Germans hated this as Germany couldn't afford to pay such a large sum of money, and it couldn't afford to fix its own problems. It also caused other problems later on, like the hyperinflation. The German army was reduced to 100,000 men. Germans hated this because it meant that they couldn't defend the country. The German government was forced to accept blame for the war. Germans hated this because it was untrue and lots of countries were to blame. Germany had to give 13% of its land to other countries and all of its empire. Germany hated this because it meant German people had to either move home or become citizens of countries that they had fought. Germany didn't think their leaders should have signed such a harsh agreement. This made Germans hate the treaty, as it made the German government look weak. Okay, pause the video here, make any corrections that you need to do, and then we'll move on. Let's do a quick source analysis to finish, unless you want to do some exam practice afterwards, of course. This is a cartoon produced in Germany in 1919 after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Have a go at these tasks, and remember some of these figures you might recognise from earlier in the lesson. So first of all, identify who the people in the picture represent. How does the picture remind us that Germany was forced to sign the treaty? And then, explain how we can tell that the artists thought that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair, and it's not just because they're from Germany. Refer to at least one example or part of the source that shows this. Right, spend about 5 minutes doing this and pause the video while you do this. Done? Okay then. We should have identified the following. This is President Wilson of the USA. Holding the trigger on the guillotine is Prime Minister Clemencau of France. And we have Prime Minister David Lloyd George of the United Kingdom. Who's this faceless person facing away from us then? This represents Germany. Shirtless, dejected, defeated, and heading for execution. So how does this picture remind us that Germany was forced to sign the treaty? Well, if the treaty is represented by the guillotine and it's ultimately going to kill Germany, how are they being forced to sign it? Look, Germany has got its hands tied. It's unable to do anything to fight back. So how can we tell that the artists thought the Treaty of Versailles was unfair? Well, I don't know what example you've referred to, but I would look towards the fact that Clemencau is holding the trigger on the guillotine. The guillotine itself represents the Treaty of Versailles and the harm that it's going to do to Germany. And it seems that this artist is most blaming the French, who have got their hand on that trigger. By pulling that string, that's going to cut Germany's head off, metaphorically speaking. So the fact that the Allies are ganging up on them, the fact that Germany looks so powerless, and the fact that the guillotine represents the damage that the Treaty of Versailles will do to them, all help show that this artist believed that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair to Germany. That's the end of this lesson, unless you want to have a quick look at some exam practice. If you do, hang on one moment. If not, thanks for watching. Just as a little bit of extra practice then, you could consider this exam style question, which is based upon the Edexcel Pearson style of exam questions in paper 2. Explain why the Treaty of Versailles was so hated by the German people. 12 marks. You may use the following in your answer. Article 231, reparations. Hopefully from this lesson you know what those are all about. You must also use information of your own. A reminder with this style of question, it would be a really good idea to refer to both Article 231 and the reparations. After all, they've been given to you. However, if you can't remember anything about them, then maybe choose other examples. That's fine, you can do so. What's really important though is that you must use information of your own. You are really limited in the number of marks that you can get if you only refer to the information that's given to you within the question. Here's how you need to answer it then. Fully explain 3 examples using PEEL, that's point, example, explain and link, and then conclude by explaining which term was the most unpopular and why. You could also conclude by explaining whether there's an overall theme to how Germany hated the Treaty of Versailles. So if you need to, you could use this as a bit of a writing frame. Make your point. Germans would have hated losing land or losing their armed forces or paying reparations or being blamed for the Treaty of Versailles. Then give an example. A way that this was done was, then explain it, the effect of this was, and then link it back to the question. This was hated by the German people because. Do about 3 paragraphs of that style, a short conclusion, and then that will get you your 12 marks, all being well. Now, sometimes I will give an example answer at the end of the lesson. I've decided not to do that, as I just sort of tack this on to the end in case anyone wanted to do it. But refer to things like the mark schemes. Have you included your own knowledge? Have you explained with relation to the question? That's the crucial link sentences at the end there. And have you used both of the examples given within the question and examples from your own knowledge? If you've done all of these things and expanded on it in enough detail, you can probably count yourself as having done pretty well. On that note, that's the end of the lesson. I hope it's all been useful to you. If it has, like the video and then subscribe to the channel. You could also put in the comments what you think was the most harsh term of the Treaty of Versailles. And don't forget LAM. Land, army, money and blame. Goodbye for now.